It is not easy to do justice to the topic of mission or missions in 15 or 18-minute talk. So in today's topic, which is mission, I would like to address the more important aspects of mission and probably give some thoughts about the modern view of missions. So we'll start basically with the rationale for missions and then go on to consider the ways that it is being done. So in Packer's book, the topic mission is, the principle is very simple. Christ sends the church into the world. I remember many years ago when Packer came out with a book and they were all saying, that the new call to mission is, as the Father has sent me, I also send you. Whereas for many hundreds of years prior, the Great Commission was the paradigm for mission. So the question then would be, how has the Father sent Jesus? In what way? What did Jesus do in his passive obedience, in his active obedience when he was in this world? And could this be a mirror through which we could see how to do missions today? Though, of course, the Great Commission still applies. We're still supposed to go and make disciples of all nations and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And not just doing that, we have to teach them to observe all things that Jesus has commanded, knowing that the Lord is with us in his Spirit to the end of the age. So what is the definition of mission? In its very basic understanding, mission just means sending, being sent out. And the words represent Jesus's statement that we have this capacity to be sent out into the world. In some respects, in the early church, immediately after the death and resurrection of Christ, a lot of this was done by evangelists going from various cities to build up a congregation of believers, the classic example being Paul. But over the years, particularly after the Reformation, there was this trend towards societies or groups sending out missionaries under their auspices. Whichever one it is, whether it is the Universal Church, Parachurch, or the local congregation that is sending out people, it is a specific defined task. Jesus has asked us to do this, and we are called to do it. It's a command. It's not like optional for us. So in the scriptures, we see that missions consist of two aspects. The first task is that we are called to go and witness, proclaim Jesus, proclaim the gospel, the true gospel. And this includes the need for understanding that there is a creator God. If you come from a Hindu land or a more polytheistic land like I grew up in, you'll realize that it's often important first to bring the person to understand that there is a creator God who is separate from the creation. After which we can talk about how we can be reconciled to that same creator God. And the only way we can do that is to proclaim Jesus. And the invitation is then given. Once they accept that there's a creator God and there's a separation between man and God, that there's an invitation to repentance and faith/salvation. So the ministry of the church planter, or the ministry of an evangelist, or a ministry of a local group of people is not just to local missions, but also to missions through the whole world, depending on our resources, depending on our abilities, and whether circumstances open up for us to do this. Secondly, the Christians and churches are called to practice the deeds of mercy and compassion. And this often went hand in hand with the early missionaries. Some of the missionaries that first came to my ancestors 7 generations ago practiced both. They set up both churches as well as mission schools, mission hospitals. So practicing the deeds of mercy and compassion reflects the compassion of Jesus for us. And it fulfills the second great commandment, which states, love your neighbor as yourselves. This actually gives credibility to the proclamation of the gospel. If if, especially in today's culture, if we are seen to be dismissive or unloving, often that is a turnoff for the person who is being spoken to be able to even begin to comprehend what, or to begin to even listen to us. So Jesus points to Matthew 5:16, where he says, the acts of mercy that we do can point people to the proclamation of the gospel. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. And the effect of that would be to glorify your Father in heaven and bring them into the kingdom of God. Now, while Jesus' ministry was primarily to the Jews, particularly if you go back to Jeremiah 31, you would see that when Jeremiah talked about the new covenant, he was actually speaking to the Jews. And so when Jesus came, that was his primary ministry as he fulfilled the scriptures. But he did anticipate that there will be a ministry to the Gentiles, and the classic story that we read is when he was going through Samaria and talked to the Samaritan woman. In a similar manner, Paul often went to the Jews first when he went to a city. The Jews were scattered throughout the Roman Empire, and he would go to where they were gathered, typically maybe to the synagogue, and he would go to them first. And in some way, where God has ordained, Jews had the right to hear the gospel first. And therefore, the evangelistic outreach to Jews must continue as part of the church's ministry. From a cultural point of view, as it went towards, as Gentiles flooded into the church and accepted the proclamation of the gospel, you do know that in Galatians, there was a issue with regard to should the Gentile Christians also follow the ceremonial law, things like circumcision. So while Christian Jews are free from this ceremonial law, they are still free to follow their own customs that express their ethnic culture and does not leave behind their ethnic identity. Same applies to the Gentiles. This process is called contextualization. And how do you contextualize and how do you figure out to proclaim the gospel within the cultural context of the people group that you're going to? This is a challenge and requires a deep understanding of the culture to which people are going in to minister. It's a whole large topic which we could probably discuss in the discussion. But therefore, that's the challenge today in where previously we had to go to another country to share the gospel in a multicultural way. The challenge today is that all the cultures have come to us. And it's not just the religions that are brought into our local setting. It is also that most local and those who grew up maybe in cultural Christian homes have become atheists. I saw a study yesterday in the US where it says that the majority of the children of Christians now, that means over 50%, now claim atheism. So it's a very hostile world. And we have to do what we would call maybe worldview evangelism towards our culture today. And it's the same type of evangelism which we used to do back in a multi-religious society in Asia, where you have to come to this position of worldview, understanding that God is the creator and that we are the creation, that we are a created being, that God has created matter, space, and time. Unless you can bring their worldview into this paradigm, it's almost impossible to share the gospel. So the atheist has to come into this understanding that there's a God who has created us, and we are not just here by chance. The polytheist or the panentheist or the pantheist, those who believe we are God, have to be brought into this situation as well. But since Pentecost, we have to accept that Christianity has been and will be a multi-ethnic body of believers who have come from all these different backgrounds. While they maintain some of their cultural aspects, many of their cultural tenets may have to be changed because they are based on a pagan worldview rather than a gospel worldview. So given this mandate, and we are now here sitting in various churches in our local situation, I was wondering, we could ask ourselves three questions and three broad categories of questions, let's put it that way. So first is local missions. Our church, like the one that David and I attend, we are situated in a particular place, in a particular location of the city. Where Richard is a place that I used to live many years ago. So I know that location very well. The demographic in these two locations are totally different. But when we attend church, we've got to ask ourselves, does our church reflect the demographics of the surrounding community? And if it doesn't, why not? Are we following the mission of God to reach out to these people who are in our demographic? I remember when we were doing the search committee for a new pastor after our long-term pastor left before, one or two of the candidates actually came with the demographics of the surrounding community. They had done their homework. They came and said, these are the demographics. We want to look at the local community and we want to make sure that our local mission is culturally contextualized towards these people so that we can proclaim the gospel. But that brings up the next question, should all churches be multi-ethnic? There is this trend today to say that if the church is majority white, something's wrong with that church or it's defective. I do not subscribe to that idea. I think that it all depends on the demographics of the surrounding community, the historicity of that church, and we all grow depending on the type of community and the type of worship that we do as a community. So I would not put race or other things as a primary motivator for local missions. I would more suggest that we look at the demographics of the surrounding community in which we live in and then tailor our local missions to that. And I welcome some comments from anyone, particularly I think David has done a lot of local missions, so I would like to hear from him. Secondly, foreign missions. Now, foreign missions, as we know, began really stepping up about 200 years ago. That model was where a missionary society would be set up somewhere in the UK, the US, but mainly in the UK and to some extent in Europe. The missionaries who came out to southern India 200 years ago, where our ancestors, my ancestors, came to Christ in 1806, would be we are highly thankful for those who came out at that time. However, does this model still work today? Especially in today's situation where you just cannot go to every country claiming to do Christian missionary work. Unfortunately, I think, and that's my observation, is that many of the missionary agencies today may be anachronistic. That means probably a little outdated. And this idea of raising massive amounts of funds to send small groups of people or families out to do missionary work in other countries may need to be reassessed, because we've got to ask ourselves question number two, what is the role of the local missionary in that land? God has raised up many local Christians who would be adept in the language, the culture, and the knowledge to be able to reach their local congregations, local people. 200 years ago, for example, when the missionaries first came out, they went to virgin lands where there was no Christian presence, no social media, no TV, nothing that explained who Jesus was. But today there are locals who can do this very work within their lands. How can we help them? Number three, what about reverse migration? We have so many people of multiple lands and cultures who have come to Canada. Many of them come to Christ, they become passionate for ministry. How about them going back and doing tent making ministries? I've seen, for example, in India, some Indians who have grown up in New Zealand, Australia, who can speak the language, who have actually gone back to the bewilderment of their parents who migrated in the first place. But they've gone back to serve in the lands from which their parents came from. Again, another aspect we can discuss. Lastly, short-term missions. What is the objective and purpose? When I first join any church, I often look at the missions that they do. And for many years, short-term missions were a focus, particularly sending out young kids to do various things in various lands. I was a little perplexed, to be honest, because I had gone out to do some missionary work in Africa, and I used to think, how effective is it that churches spend 40,000, 80,000? In fact, I think 80,000 once to send a few kids to Uganda to play soccer and befriend locals. Is there a better way to motivate and support mission work local and abroad? Because anecdotally, the participants usually will come back and they will recount their cross-cultural experiences. That may have been true 40, 50 years ago, but today cross-cultural experiences are available within Canada, within the US. And in principle, short-term missions were stated to change the lives and bring up a missionary zeal among the young people so that they would go out in long-term missions. But research actually has shown that despite a vast growth in short-term missions, they don't change participants' lives when they come back. They are the same apart from an initial hype. They don't cause more people to commit to long-term missions. And they often harm both local economy and the orphans. Because if you go there and give them expensive gifts and then come back, and then there's no follow-up, it's extremely difficult. It also disrupts the work of local missionaries and local churches. And I found this scenario to be true, that churches are less likely to support a long-term missionary than to send a group of teens or a group of men or a small group to paint a house or to do a VBS in a country often where they don't speak the language. So I did mention in my email that this talk may generate some discussion, and I look forward to that. So, is all short-term mission bad? Well, I've been on short-term missions, and so I got to say that it's not all bad. Otherwise, I'll be condemning myself to some extent. But there is a positive aspect for short-term missions, and the positive aspect is if it meets crisis needs. When I sat in a mission committee, I think it was 14 years ago, in our church, there was a thought of sending out short-term mission to go and just encourage the local missionary or maybe to do some hairstyling or something. Those are not crisis needs. Crisis needs are things like addressing natural disasters, an influx of displaced people, or something that the long-term worker cannot handle alone, some specific project. Like when I went up to Angola, I remember that they were having difficulty with the generator. The electrical supply in that place was very poor. So two people came out from a church, from a short-term mission to fix the generator and get things moving. So it is important that short-term missions actually send trained workers who will help and not hinder the efforts of long-term missionaries. I got most of this material on short-term missions from this article by Darren Carlson, so I encourage you to look it up. It's in your notes. So the points to ponder as we close. How are you personally engaging in the mission of Jesus? Personal evangelism one-on-one, missions, if missions, what kind of missions? If supporting missionaries, what kind of support? And lastly, works of compassion that allow us to proclaim Jesus.